A warm welcome to the fourth video in our series on the core theme, knowledge and the knower. Now, one of the richest and most engaging elements of the new TOK course is its emphasis on ethics. Ethics is a broad term referring to the study of how people should behave. When you question whether an action is good or bad, or right or wrong, you're asking questions in the field of ethics. The IB learner profile assumes that acting in a principled way, which involves honesty, fairness, and responsibility, is what IB Diploma program students should do. As a knower, however, we might question where your own personal values and standards of ethics come from. What is a good life? How should you live your life? What are the sources of your beliefs about right and wrong? Are there only personal standards of right and wrong? Or are there broader shared standards or even universal standards across different cultures? If there are such standards, what is their justification? This strand of the knowledge framework is concerned with addressing how ethics influences areas of knowledge, as well as our response to knowledge questions we encounter. Ethics deals with moral choices we make that reflect our values of good and bad, right and wrong. Everyday life involves ethical decisions. Think of the world around you, from our friendships to our school life, to our conduct in public. Ethical considerations are all around us, from do not plagiarize to the IB learner profile encouragement to be principled. Our lives to some extent are governed by ethical standards and norms that deserve scrutiny. You might discover that moral thinking in one cultural context is not the same as another. Furthermore, you may think that we have a duty for honesty over kindness, or vice versa, regardless of our national or cultural identity. Here we must distinguish between first-order and second-order ethical questions. First-order ethical questions arise in the real world, such as whether it is right for a country to possess nuclear weapons, or whether it is right or wrong to conduct experiments on animals for the sake of medical science. First-order ethical questions include, is cloning right or wrong? Is a particular government policy ethical? Is the use of driverless cars right or wrong? Second-order ethical questions, on the other hand, are of a higher order and relate to the thinking about and the thinking beyond those ethical questions, such as whether an ethical belief is true or false, or what evidence would justify an ethical argument. Second-order questions include, is there ethical truth? And if so, what is its nature? Are there ethical facts about the world? What is the role of intuition in constructing ethical knowledge? Everyday moral decision-making, known as first-order thinking, is not really our focus here. Instead, in TOK, our focus is on second-order thinking, that is, thinking about how we know what is ethical. Ethical considerations shape who we are as knowers, and who we are as knowers shapes our ethical considerations. Our moral choices express something about who we are as people. As a knower, you may think that we have a certain degree of moral responsibility, for example, in a science experiment, reporting on all our findings without ignoring outlying data, or having integrity in our pursuit of knowledge. Ethical dilemmas arise in everyday life when you find yourself in a situation where two principles conflict. This involves a question about how we know what the right response is. For example, if your friend has given you a gift that you don't like, how should you respond? In this dilemma, you might be conflicted between the honest response and the kind response. But when honesty and kindness conflict, how should you act? How do we know what the right response is? Ethical considerations can also influence our pursuit of knowledge and our decisions as to what knowledge we pursue. For example, in the arts, there's an important question about the ethics of suitable subject material. Some people would argue that the arts should be free from any ethical constraints, while others would argue that some degree of censorship is required. Ethics here plays a role in terms of the scope that we think is appropriate for an area of knowledge. For example, pornography, which depicts indecent images, might be said to fall outside the scope of the arts. Furthermore, ethical considerations are built into the methods that are used and impact the pursuit and construction of knowledge. What are the ethical responsibilities of a scientist, a historian, an artist? How do they know what ethical considerations should shape the construction of knowledge? This is a crucially important question in each area of knowledge, given that knowledge can be applied to either heal or harm, from the use of vaccinations to the atom bomb. In all areas, professionals have formal codes of ethics by which practitioners are expected to abide. For example, In the sciences, experiments should be carried out using the principles of honesty and integrity and obtaining consent when relevant. If people do not, then they can be censored, and all of their past work comes into question until it can be re-verified by someone who has not been branded unethical. It is important we consider our responsibilities as knowers in the context of the different fields of knowledge and communities we are part of. Ethical conclusions deal with should and ought. They prescribe how we should act in the world, and they carry as a result implications for action. They carry, in short, responsibility. We turn now to the question of how do we know what is right and wrong? On one hand, how we feel seems to influence our judgment of right and wrong. We may instantly feel repulsion to horrific acts. Our moral knowledge might be based on a gut feeling, an intuition that enables us to know the difference between right and wrong. For example, some people feel that the use of animal experiments in the development of pharmaceutical drugs is intuitively wrong. However, you may be able to put forward reasoned arguments to support or oppose the use of animal experiment independently of how you feel about the issue. Although we may have an intuitive sense of right and wrong, our intuition raises a number of questions. We might want to know the extent of which this gut reaction is the result of our upbringing, our education, our cultural values, or our life experiences. We might also question whether this intuition we have is due to a deeply held value system and belief framework, or whether it connects with a more universal truth. Those from a religious background might argue that we have an innate sense of right and wrong, originating from God Himself. Although we often respond emotionally to ethical problems, there's usually a rational basis to our feelings of right and wrong. Theories of ethics have been proposed by various philosophers and thinkers over the years. Each of them gives an answer to the question, how do we know what is ethical? There are three main categories of ethical theory which I will briefly cover: deontological theory, consequentialist theories, and virtue ethics. Deontological theories suggest actions are good or bad according to a clear set of rules. The philosopher Immanuel Kant is the main proponent of deontological ethics and believes that there is a universal moral law that all people are obliged to follow. He called this law the categorical imperative, which states that we should always act in a way that we will be willing for it to be a general law that everyone else in similar circumstances should follow. For example, we should not steal if we would not want everyone else to be allowed to steal. Kant argued that it would be irrational not to obey this universal moral law. Some people regard the categorical imperative as a universal truth that all people have a duty to obey, regardless of their circumstances and their emotional state. Consequentialist theories, meanwhile, decide whether actions are good or bad based on the outcomes or consequences of those actions. This might seem like a reasonable way to evaluate ethical actions. However, the measure of outcomes is problematic. Does someone consider the consequences of the action from their own perspective or the perspective of others? And how do you measure the benefit arising from the action? There may be scenarios you can think of where unethical actions could be justified on the grounds of the consequences of the action, taking from the rich to give to the poor, or harming one person in order to save the lives of 10 people. Considering the consequences alone might not seem to provide a reliable measure of whether or not an action is ethical. Utilitarianism is a consequentialist theory that suggests that an action is ethical if it produces certain consequences or results. Utilitarianism, like other consequentialist theories, measures the moral worth of an action by its effects. An act is good if it increases pleasure or happiness, and bad if it increases pain or suffering. This measurement can be applied to individual actions, act utilitarianism, or to general rules of behavior, rule utilitarianism. A world in which everyone follows the rule not to steal, for example, might arguably be a happier world. Judging an action's likely outcome and consequences depends on imagining and anticipating the foreseeable consequences and weighing up which would be more favorable. Virtue ethics is quite different in that rather than trying to distinguish between good and bad behaviors, it considers the moral character of the person carrying out the action. According to this theory, the same actions can be good or bad depending on the circumstances, and virtue is a moral characteristic that is developed by living virtuously. For example, A virtue ethicist might say that fighting can be good or bad depending on the circumstances, and a virtuous person would only fight if it were right and just to do so. Virtue ethics prompts people to ask, what sort of person do I want to be? And how can I become that sort of person? Some people will regard it as true that there are key virtues, such as wisdom, justice, self-care, and faithfulness. Considering different approaches to the construction of ethical knowledge is relevant to your understanding of yourself as a knower. Ethical frameworks and judgments are often tied to one's individual background, beliefs, and value systems, which are affected by the different knowledge communities we are part of. Engaging with ethics and its related concepts in every aspect of the course will give you a context for appreciating contrasting perspectives and alternative ways of thinking and in constructing knowledge on right and wrong, and in doing so, inform your own perspectives as knowers. Many of you will turn out to be doctors, entrepreneurs, scientists, and even civil servants. You will be in positions to influence and affect society and the world around you, to actually make a difference. With this comes a certain responsibility in terms of how you use or abuse the knowledge that you possess. In engaging with ethics through the course, it will hopefully challenge you as to what your roles and responsibilities might be as a member of the global community and inform your decision-making and action not just as students now, but in the future positions you take in whatever fields of knowledge you will partake in. As the famous Albert Einstein shared, those who have the privilege to know have the duty to act. And with that, I thank you for listening and wish you all the best as you continue your journey in TOK.